Diane, they're after me. I have to lay low here for a little while. Good thing I've got this box of donuts in this coffee. Anyway, I have a very important message for you. My box fan is no longer operational. I repeat, my box fan is broken. I hope you can read between the lines. I'm getting ready to review those files that you sent me, Diane. As always, your attention to detail is spotless. I'm going to be reviewing the files now. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. This is Special Agent Dan Doug reporting for duty. You know, I've been thinking a lot about aliens recently. I've noticed they've gone pretty mainstream lately. I don't know if you noticed this. It used to be the case that abduction stories, UFO sightings were the things saved for supermarket tabloids, but over the past couple years I've noticed that this topic has become more and more mainstream, gracing the pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and pretty much every other newspaper you can imagine. Also in congressional hearings and in best-selling books that are put out by large, reputable publishers. Scientists with backgrounds at places like Harvard and Stanford are talking about this topic openly now. But here's the problem, and this is the pattern that I've seen with these types as they go on podcasts or they write their books or they appear before Congress. Here's the pattern that I notice. Hello, I am a well-credentialed expert with years of government experience, and I've seen some crazy stuff having to do with UFOs. Wow, that is crazy. Could you say something more specific about that? No. This is the pattern. Someone with classified information reveals general things up to a point about UFOs. They've seen something crazy. They've seen alien bodies. They have intelligence that nobody else has. And then when they're asked to be specific, they can't reveal any specific information because that's classified. And look, that makes sense. Divulging classified information is, of course, a crime. But why tease us? What is with all this teasing? It's like they're throwing red meat at us with this UFO stuff. And it's like, I don't know about you, but I'm starting to get a little hungry for more. What's really going on here? This video is an attempt to make sense of the UFO phenomenon, especially in light of the recent uptick in news stories about it. I'm just taking a look at the publicly available data to see if there's any patterns that emerge or any story that emerges from what's out there. Does any of the material out there suggest that we actually have been visited by alien life? And whatever you personally think about the UFO, UAP topic, the story of the government's handling of this information is full of tricksters, hucksters, senators, farmers, military brass, leading scientists, and spies. It's a story about how governments wield top-secret information and how experts establish credibility when the public doubts the purity of their motives. And maybe above all, it's a story about the limits of human knowledge and our place in the universe. Part 1. 1946. Ufologists or historians of the UFO phenomenon will typically want to begin in the year 1947 with the first ever official UFO sighting. But I actually think this is a mistake. I think it's better to start in the year 1946, specifically August 31st, a 31,000-word essay by a little-known journalist named John Hersey was published in the New Yorker magazine. Not only was it published in the New Yorker, but it was the first article ever to take up an entire issue. The title of this article was called Hiroshima. Today, we look back on Hiroshima and Nagasaki with much clearer eyes, but at the time, very few people in the American public had any idea about the capabilities of atomic weapons. And this is because almost nobody knew what was going on behind the scenes at the Manhattan Project, with the $28 billion that they had used with a staff of around 130,000 people. They had been able to keep all of that under wraps for years. And so this article, for the first time, exposed the American public to what really happened on Japanese soil. People with melted eyeballs, or people vaporized, leaving only their shadows etched into walls. Their faces were wholly burned, their eye sockets were hollow, the fluid from their melted eyes had run down their cheeks. It's against this backdrop that we should look at all the events that happened in 1947. It will explain much of the public's alarmed reaction as well as the government's to what we're about to uncover. So much happened in 1947 that it would be difficult to cover all of it, but we'll do the best that we can. On March 12, 1947, during a joint session of Congress, the same man who made the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, President Harry S. Truman, delivered a speech calling on Congress to provide $400 million to the governments of Greece and Turkey to combat communist overthrows in both of those countries. If the U.S. did not do this, he explained, it would endanger the political stability of Turkey, which would undermine the political stability of the Middle East. Truman argued in his speech that the United States had an obligation to protect the free peoples of Greece and Turkey, who are struggling to fight against totalitarian regimes. I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. This was the Truman Doctrine, and also the beginning of the Cold War. war. Everybody knew who Truman really had in his sights in this speech, and it was the Soviet Union. The post-war global order was being born. Two important factors of which were nuclear paranoia and a strong stance against Soviet Russia. Only 3 months later, in June of 1947, the term flying saucer would be coined by accident. Kenneth Arnold was an experienced pilot with over 4,000 hours of logged flight time. Government officials would later deem him to be a sound witness of credible mind. He saw 9 unidentified flying objects during his flight over Mount Rainier, Washington. He described each object as bow-shaped, about 100 feet across, and with no discernible tail. The objects periodically flipped, banked, and weaved side to side, like the tail of a Chinese kite.
Well, they didn't fly in the conventional formation that's taught in our Army. They seemed to kind of weave in and out right above the mountaintops. And I would say that they even went down into the canyons in several instances, probably 100 feet. But I could see them against the snow, of course, on Mount Rainier, and against the snow on Mount Adams as they were flashing. Like I told the Associated Press, I'd be glad to confirm it with my hands on a Bible, because I did see it. And whether it has anything to do with our Army or our intelligence, or whether it has to do with some foreign country, I don't know.
Well, Kenneth, thank you very much. I know that you've certainly been busy these last 24 hours, because I've spent some of the time with you myself. And from New York, I understand they're after this story. And we may have an answer for it before night, because if it is some new type of Army or Navy secret missile saying that it is a new secret plane, and that will be all there is to it, and they will hush up the story, or perhaps that we will finally get a definite answer to it.
Although it was not his first thought, as time went on, Arnold would go on to believe that what he had witnessed that day was truly alien life. The fact remains that even today, nobody knows what Kenneth Arnold really saw. The story gained national news attention. Experts from all over the country weighed in on what they thought really happened. One famous skeptic, Donald Menzel, thought that Arnold had only seen maybe a flock of seagulls that day. If you Google the first ever UFO sighting, Kenneth Arnold's name is likely to come up. But technically speaking, people have been claiming to see flying ships in the sky for much longer than this. There are countless news articles from the 1800s and even before this of people seeing unexplained things in the sky. In the pre-modern era, this was usually interpreted through the lens of mystical or religious experiences. The Arnold sighting, though, occurred at a time when human airflight was a known technology. And because of the heightened awareness around nuclear power and the possibility of military combatants flying over US airspace, the public's attention was captured on a much broader scale. And not only the public, but the government's attention was captured too, particularly the Department of War's attention. Just 3 months after the Kenneth Arnold sighting, the US Air Force was formed as a separate branch of the military. Coincidence? Actually, probably it was, because the legislation that formed the Air Force itself, the National Security Act of 1947, was proposed earlier in this year, and many high-ranking members of the military had been advocating for the Air Force to be its own branch of the military for years before this. But regardless of the timing, the United States Air Force becoming its own branch of the military would prove fateful for the research of UFOs, because the task of researching these sightings would largely fall to them. And lucky for them, they weren't going to have to wait very long to crack their first big case, because just a couple months after this, Roswell happened. In early July, a rancher named Mac Brazel recovered strange debris scattered across his property near Roswell, New Mexico, which he could not identify. Metal sticks and beams, a reflective material like tin foil, strips of rubber, and even tape. The official story of this debris does not sound like something you would normally associate with UFOs. Rubber and tape is hardly something you can picture flying light years across the cold vacuum of space. But the unofficial story of this debris is that what Mac really uncovered that day was something very different. Lieutenant Walter Haut, the public information officer at Roswell Army Airfield, issued a press release that day under orders from Base Commander Colonel William Blanchard, stating that they had recovered a flying disc. The next day, this story was retracted, and instead it was claimed that they had recovered a weather balloon. The intelligence officer in charge of investigating this case was Jesse Marcel. During interviews years later, he would insist that what he saw that day was not a weather balloon at all, but it was something of alien origin.
They took pictures, of course. They had a whole flock of microphones there. They wanted me they wanted some comments from me, but I wasn't at liberty to do that. So all I could do is keep my mouth shut. And General Ramey is the one who discussed or told the newspapers, the newsmen, what it was, and to forget about it. It was nothing more than a weather observation balloon, of course, which we both knew differently.
There are also some documents floating out there called the Majestic documents, which go into a little bit of detail about what was really recovered at Roswell Roswell, although the legitimacy of these documents is highly questioned even by UFO enthusiasts. What's kind of funny is they have the word bogus written all over them. I mean, I don't know, this is just a funny way for an intelligence agency to delegitimize a document. Other witnesses besides Jesse Marcel have also insisted over the years that what they saw at Roswell was certainly not human in origin. Many also claim that they were intimidated by government officials to cover up anything that they knew and to never speak about it, and the debris that was left on their property was swiftly and aggressively recovered. We also will probably never know what happened at Roswell either. So much time has passed, but here are some important things to note when thinking about Roswell. The 509th Bomber Squadron was stationed at Roswell at the time, the only squadron at the time with nuclear capability. To some, this seems to suggest a nuclear capability cover-up, as it were. In 1994, a special report put out by the Air Force essentially admitted this. They claimed that what had been recovered really was not a weather balloon, but a secret spy balloon called Project Mogul. It was designed to fly at very high altitudes over Soviet airspace with audio equipment that could detect whether or not they were testing atomic weapons. This is now kind of the official Wikipedia version of the events. After this, the case was considered closed.
This will be the final word on the Roswell incident.
But there are additional witness testimonies that claim that they had also seen bodies near the wreckage at Roswell. And this tends to complicate the picture a little bit. How and why would bodies be around high-altitude air balloons that were designed to have audio equipment in them? The answer given by the government was that the people who claimed they had seen bodies were misremembering the dates, and that these tests were not really happening in 1947, but actually later in around the years 1951 to 53. And so the government claims that these witnesses underwent time compression, and that they may or may not have seen bodies, but these were likely crash test dummies that were simply mistaken for bodies. Although they do admit that one or two of these may have been deceased test pilots that were testing novel and experimental aircrafts at the time. So the claim is that all of these witnesses just so happened to be misremembering these dates, something that would have been earth-shattering to witness and that they would have remembered for the rest of their lives. Seems pretty unlikely to me. Some theorists have gone so far as to suggest that the UFO angle is a convenient cover story for what was really being hidden at Roswell. For instance, there were projects like the declassified Sunshine Project, which involved testing human subjects, that was being done at the behest of Operation Paperclip, which had recruited top Nazi scientists in order to aid the technological development of US weapon systems. This was not well known at the time and probably would not have gone over very well with the American public. So a cover-up here does seem plausible.
Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Werner von Braun.
Some of the things done under Project Sunshine were pretty disturbing, involving testing inmates or children with disabilities to see how they would react to extreme high altitudes. Years after Roswell, the Government Accountability Office did an audit of everything that happened there. They found that administrative records at Roswell Army Airfield were missing from the years 1945 to 1949. Many messages going both in and out are simply completely missing. Typically, there would have been a disposition record which should have been kept on file to determine who would have made this authorization to do away and dispose of all these records, but no such disposition record ever seems to have been made. It simply doesn't exist. The GAO also found in 1947 that Army regulations stated that a report should have been filed on any type of crash that happened, and yet there were no crash reports filed for the incidents at Roswell. Walter Haut, the public information officer who was in charge of putting out the initial report, also claimed years later that what he saw was alien in origin and not a weather balloon at all. Witnesses claimed that they had seen many strange things at Roswell, and we will probably never know what really happened. Some people claimed they had seen child-sized corpses, metal that could fold itself back into shape. Whatever happened at Roswell, whether it was aliens or not, you can guarantee it probably was no ordinary matter. Part 2. You're getting warmer. After 1947, the government put together more formal groups to start investigating UFOs. This was partly due to public pressure to have informed answers about what these unidentified objects were. Certain generals wanted to have answers ready when public concerns would rise, and also because airspace was becoming increasingly a battleground between nation-states to flex their technological muscles. If the Soviets or China had a super weapon, we wanted to know about it. The 1950s and 60s were an era of staggering change in American life. The post-war economic boom created unprecedented opportunity and expansion of possibility, including technology. But when the Russians sent Sputnik into space, U.S. intelligence agencies and military were alarmed, to say the very least. It seemed to disprove the theory that the Soviet Empire was a backwater without technology and a barely functioning economy. How could such a people beat the United States launching satellites into space? This put the executive branch of the U.S. on its heels and supercharged the U.S. efforts to further its technological development. Already, technology was increasing across multiple domains. Radar was becoming more useful. Every year, more powerful rockets were being made. Early forms of computers were being developed, and eventually we would even send men to the moon. During this time, the Air Force had cobbled together several programs that were apparently designed to investigate UFO sightings. These were the famous Project Sign, Project Grudge, and Project Bluebook. We don't have enough time to go too deeply into these programs. That would require a video all of its own. But the basic pattern went like this. The Air Force would get a report of a UFO, and this program had to develop a system to categorize each sighting. Could it be disproved easily? Was it a weather occurrence or a well-known test vehicle that had been mistaken for a UFO? If so, it would go into this pile. Could it be disproved with more effort? Some of the more interesting sightings were investigated and then later disproved, which would go into yet a separate pile, until a small number of sightings would then go into an unexplained pile. As the years went on, this unexplained pile continued to grow. The scientist that the Air Force had hired to lead this effort was named J. Allen Hynek. He began his government career spending most of his time debunking claims of alien spacecraft.
When you first get a report of a sighting, is your job to assemble evidence that will prove it to be so, or to assemble evidence to prove that it did not happen? You know, there are two ways to go on any investigation.
The first thing we do is to try to disprove it. Because what is the point of establishing, of perpetuating a myth or something that isn't so? We get reports every night from police departments or different parts of the country. Most of them are planets, twinkling stars.
Explainable or identifiable things.
The IFOs, we call them, identifiable flying objects. But that remaining 10%, those are the ones we go after. Now, a UFO, the U in UFO, of course, simply means unidentified. It does not necessarily mean visitors from outer space. But it must be unidentified not just to the person who is puzzled by it, but it must remain unidentified after considerable study. Then and only then is it a UFO.
But as time went on, he became more open to the idea that a certain percentage of sightings could in fact be authentic extraterrestrials.
I started almost as a complete skeptic because I thought the whole thing was a question of post-war nerves, but it was the persistence of the phenomenon. It refused to dry up and blow away. That finally led me to the belief that we had a real phenomenon to deal with.
Alongside these government efforts to investigate were NICAP, or the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, which was a civilian-run organization that reported on UFO sightings and witness testimony.
We have a great deal of proof in the form of thousands of eyewitness reports from very reputable individuals and very competent observers. We have physical evidence that these things have touched down and left markings on the ground. In certain cases, the landing sites have been radioactive, and there are other physical evidences of this sort, including a few photographs which we would consider authentic.
In addition to the government effort being done at Bluebook and the civilian effort at NICAP, there was yet a third group known as Project Ozma, or what would later be known as SETI. Project Ozma was run by a man named Frank Drake, a scientist out of Cornell University. Ozma began as a hypothetical problem much closer to Earth. A small group of scientists had begun gathering and pondering the likelihood of extraterrestrial life in our galaxy and beyond, as they discussed how unlikely it would be for humans to be alone in a universe so vast beyond imagination. One scientist named John Lilly, who was attempting to study the language of dolphins, brought up a salient point. Dolphins were incredibly intelligent creatures, and yet they had not built rocket technology. What if the universe was filled with intelligent life, but our ability as humans to develop aerospace technology was a unique product of our specific intelligence? Could the example of the dolphin prove to be another variable relevant to the Fermi paradox? It's the problem of why we don't seem to be able to detect any intelligent life in a universe which, statistically speaking, should be filled with it. The scientists were so compelled by the example of the dolphin that they named themselves the Order of the Dolphin. Thus began a decades-long quest by scientists to search the sky for answers. Rather than focus on UFO UAP sightings, Project Ozma focused on the development of radio technology to essentially listen to the stars for signs of intelligent life. These efforts were important for shaping the scientific understanding not only of the nature of magnetism and radio waves in the universe, but the hypothetical theoretical and statistical probability of life on other planets. This serves as an important background consideration when thinking about UFO/UAP sightings. One consistent problem that still haunts the field today is knowing how much skepticism to apply to any individual sighting, given the likelihood of alien life in general. If the probability of intelligent life in the universe is low, then it would make sense to apply a good amount of skepticism to all UFO/UAP sightings. But if the probability of alien life is high, then one would approach UFO/UAP sightings very differently. J. Allen Hynek faced this and many other paradoxes throughout his career with the Air Force. Hynek also noticed that a number of people that he interviewed were embarrassed to even claim that they had seen a UFO in the first place. They did not want any publicity for fear that their reputations or their careers might be ruined. Some high-profile unexplained sightings were the Socorro incident, the Exeter incident, and the Hillsdale College sighting. I'll link in the description to good videos on all these sightings. During his tenure, J. Allen Hynek created a three-category system that might sound familiar to you. Close encounters of the first, second, and third kinds. Close encounters of the first kind, or someone who saw a ship. Close encounters of the second kind were witnessing debris or burn marks on the ground. And close encounters of the third kind is when people claim to be abducted or meet aliens face to face. This last category, of course, proved to be most controversial. Abductions are really kind of an entirely separate category from this video. We might do a video on that maybe someday in the future. Suffice it to say, they're much more difficult to prove. They involve much more highly subjective data. Sometimes these involve people experiencing visible injuries and sometimes not. There's a surprising amount of overlap between subjects of the classified program MK Ultra and people who claim to have been abducted by aliens. If you don't know much about MK Ultra, it was a highly classified program at the time that did a lot of edge case experimentation on people, including the use of LSD and other ritualistic and strange experiments to probe the human psyche for secrets. They were looking for a truth serum drug, something that would allow them to interrogate subjects and retrieve information that they wanted. Maybe you see where I'm going with this. MK Ultra was a sufficiently seedy operation that involved doing a lot of heinous, unethical things to test subjects. It would not be surprising to me if memories of these events, perhaps aided and augmented by hallucinatory drugs, were stored in the form of these abduction narratives, as a way for the test subjects to hide from themselves what had really happened to them.
Tell me about the acid.
I'd rather not. It's a bad trip. It's a bad trip. That was a bad trip. The pain was so excruciating. Felt like somebody was sticking me with 1,000,000 pins. You know, just everywhere. Oh, it just... Ow.
You want to stop for me?
I should stress that there is no proven connection between MK Ultra and alien abductions. There is a surprising amount of overlap. It's something that I certainly was not expecting to find, and so I think it needs to be studied more. Part 3. Skeptics and Debunkers. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, different congressional committees were formed. First, the Robertson Committee, formed by the CIA, then the O'Brien Committee, and finally the Condon Committee, which was formed by the Air Force. All three of these committees concluded that there was nothing to UFO sightings that warranted further study. In fact, the influx of reports hindered the government's ability to deal properly with actual threats to national security. Essentially, UFOs were a distraction needed to be dealt with. Interestingly, some of the committee notes from these hearings included ideas to pay media companies to spread messages ridiculing belief in UFOs, and focusing their efforts primarily to debunk them. Disney was even listed as one idea to do the messaging, although there's no way to tell whether this actually happened. The CIA and the Air Force might have well known that UFOs were real, and they had information that they were in fact from aliens, and they didn't want this to get out to the public. Or they might have thought that this truly was just a hoax, a craze that took over the country, and that they had bigger fish to fry, and they were done talking about UFOs. In either case, the outcome of the Condon Committee was to shut down Project Bluebook. J. Allen Hynek was disappointed with this outcome. He claimed that none of these committees chose worthy sightings to investigate. Instead, they focused on ones that could easily be debunked. He called these committees a put-up job. And to be fair, Hynek himself was no stranger to exercising exercising skepticism. Most of the thousands of sightings that his office investigated turned out to be totally and easily explainable. But he claimed that skepticism was no longer a useful tool when it prevented people from considering something which would otherwise be worthy to investigate if they had an open mind. Hynek famously said, "A scientist will confess in private interest in a subject which is controversial or not scientifically acceptable, but generally he will not stand up and be counted when in committee." What's interesting is the effect of downplaying belief in UFOs did little to actually sway people's beliefs. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, belief in UFOs simply went underground. Books were published, committees were formed, and yes, these materials were not necessarily the greatest or most factually sound pieces of content ever produced. But this is what happens when you stigmatize something. It goes underground and it grows. And out of the shadows of this obscurity came arguably one of the greatest flowerings of creative energy maybe ever. From the 1970s and 80s came a huge wave of science fiction hits. Star Wars, Star Trek, Terminator, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, E.T., Ghostbusters, Back to the Future, Dune. And into the 90s there was the X-Files and Independence Day, Twin Peaks, Men in Black, Stargate, Armageddon, The Matrix, and into the 2000s. If you count superhero movies, by the way, with alien protagonists, which I personally do count those, there were also the Avengers movies, the Star Wars prequels and sequels, the Transformers movies, and Avatar. All of these are some of the highest grossing titles of the last 30 years. And through all this skepticism and debunking of UFOs, it turns out that later this was just fertile ground for these imaginative seeds to be planted and for them to grow into works of art that we still enjoy to this day. Part 4, the modern era. Now we come full circle to the beginning of this video. In our modern day, the tides really shifted in the year 2017 with this New York Times article, "Glowing Auras and Black Money, the Pentagon's Mysterious UFO Program." This was the first article in decades from a major news organization that was really looking at UFO sightings with actual evidence and official confirmations. There have been many articles since, both in the New York Times and in other newspapers. The article revealed that Harry Reid, the once Senate Majority Leader, wanted money appropriated to a program to investigate UFOs, and that this program was kept secret. And it's worth noting that for an article like this to come out, the government agencies involved would have had to have greenlit it, otherwise it would have never seen the light of day. So this is very interesting. It seems as though between the 1960s and today, the government has done a complete about-face on this issue. Rather than discouraging belief, it seems like now they're encouraging it. Once upon a time, there was time and effort and taxpayer dollars put towards delegitimizing belief in UFOs. It was weird, it was fringe, it was not for polite society. Now, all of a sudden, it's fit for print in the New York Times. But it even gets weirder when you go one level deeper here. Not only is the government seemingly allowing this, it seems to be actively encouraging it.
Said that he had confirmation of them in 2015 when he remembers getting an email from U.S. Fleet Force Command. The video showed a flying object by a Navy aircraft doing exercises, noting that there were several near mid-air collisions.
A quick look at the who's who's list in modern-day UFO disclosure world uncovers a striking pattern of how these people tend to get involved. These people include journalists like Leslie Keane, government insiders like David Grush and Luis Elizondo, Diana Walsh-Pasulka, Tom DeLonge, Hal Puthoff, Tim Burchett, Ryan Graves, Dr. Gary Nolan. There is a pattern in all of these people's involvement with UFOs. These people have all gone on podcasts, have contributed to articles, have been very busy over the past couple years pushing this narrative about UFOs. And there's a very consistent pattern with all of these people and how they got involved in this process. The pattern goes like this. Somebody in the intelligence community approaches this person and asks for their help. They present them with information, they're asked for their expertise, and then this person is set loose to shout non-specific disclosure information from the mountaintops on podcasts, books, TV, interviews, doesn't really matter.
I was visited by some individuals and had some conversations with some other individuals about a program that I had no idea was ongoing, but it was. And it was a program involving the investigation, the government's investigation into UAP, or in the vernacular, you might call them UFOs.
And before I knew it, I was people who were a part of aerospace companies and the military began to want to correspond with me and see the data and the research that I had been doing. So that's what got me into this topic.
He goes, fly out and see me. And so I did. And that's when things really started happening. So I fly out to this airport and I sit at a table in a restaurant at the airport. No one's in there. And this gentleman sits down And the waiter comes up, he waves off the waiter, and he looks me in the eye and says it was the Cold War and we found a life form.
The pattern is remarkably consistent. These people talk about their experiences pretty openly, but most of the time when it comes to anything classified, they can't name names.
I think that's about all I can probably say about that.
So, yeah, I've not seen machines or anything like that, but I have.
You have not seen?
No.
Have you talked to people who claim they have seen machines?
Yes.
Okay, and those people are. Where do those people say they've seen the machines?
Well,
inside.
I can't say that.
The people you're surrounded by are telling you this. Is that what it is?
Well, I don't want to get into that.
So this is a very interesting and kind of frustrating pattern if you're interested in this thing. You can only get so much information from these people before they clam up and say, well, I can't get too specific. And this is kind of starting to drive me a little bit crazy. To my way of thinking, here's what I think might be happening behind the scenes. Enough time has probably elapsed that the Soviet connection to UFOs and UAP really no longer exists. Therefore, the heightened levels of counterintelligence effort and the heightened security are maybe no longer necessary with regard to UFO disclosure. Also, nuclear power is no longer 100% dependent on aircrafts after the advent of land-based ballistic missiles. Therefore, it could be the case that UFO/UAPs are no longer so tightly correlated with this specific kind of military threat, specifically an airborne airplane or an unidentified flying object that we don't know what it is. These are just my guesses, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but it seems to me that enough time has maybe passed and the geopolitical landscape is sufficiently different so that the same secrecy protocols and security protocols around UFO and UAP are maybe no longer necessary. Some people have claimed that this purposeful publishing of information is all a distraction technique to protect secret programs. They say that the government is pushing false stories through these people in order to protect itself. Here's what I think could be happening. Either the government knows extraterrestrials are real and they're releasing this information over a period of time so the public doesn't freak out, or the government has no idea whether or not extraterrestrials are real and they're slowly offloading the information they do have because they no longer really want to deal with it and they're trying to get rid of it and have private scientists take this over. Or third, the government has never come into contact with extraterrestrials, but they're saying that they are, and they're willfully misleading people for some reason that may or may not have to do with national security. And come to think of it, these three options, it's not really an either or. It could be all three or some combination because the federal government just doesn't work as like one big thing. It's full of agencies and bureaucracy with different bits and pieces of information scattered all over the place, way different levels of classification. Nobody has access to all of it. The CIA probably knows something the NSA might not know, and the Air Force might have something that the Navy doesn't have, and so on and so on. You get my point. So it could be that the current situation is some combination of these three things at different levels and at different agencies. But I think that we need to pay very close attention to these specific people and what they have to say over these next few years. UFOs, UAPs are apparently here to stay. And if that's so, you can believe that these people are going to have a lot to say about it. Based on the pattern of these people all being approached by insider intelligence people in very similar ways, and using these people to kind of funnel this information to the public has me pretty suspicious, but we shall see. It's very possible that all of this is just a psyop, that the information is just being funneled to us from intelligence agencies that are experimenting with different ways of influencing public opinion. We might have crossed into the looking glass, into the theater of the absurd. I mean, think of the power involved with wielding this kind of information. The kind of information that could rock someone's worldview, that could rock someone's religion, that could rock someone's political outlook, ideologies, governments, institutions could all come crashing down with the disclosure of this type of information. And so I remain very suspicious of this type of thing. I do not doubt the power or the competency of our intelligence agencies. If anything, I'm a little in awe and scared of it. Their ability to affect public opinion, to pull the strings of American culture has been quite something to witness over these last couple decades. And so I would not be surprised if there's much more going on here beneath the surface. What do I think the percentages are that one of these sightings or some of these sightings are actual extraterrestrials? I think there's a 70% chance in my mind that these things can be explained even though they're difficult, that there's some further explanation having to do with mind-altering drugs or having having to do with spreading false information or with experimentation on a much deeper level, intelligence agencies spreading things or spreading videos, eyewitness accounts that have been exaggerated, things like that. I think there's a 70% chance that all of these things can be explained in that way. Somebody didn't know what they were seeing. I think these are all more likely than us being visited by aliens, but I do think that there's a 30% chance that at least one of these has been a real extraterrestrial visitor. And that would really be something, wouldn't it? I don't have a lot of data to back up my 70-30 split. This is just kind of where my intuition is bringing me after all looking into all of this. All right, I'm going to end this video by imparting a piece of wisdom that I heard from my old bureau chief, Gordon Cole. When doing your own research on this topic, always remember, keep your eye on the donut, not the hole. Hey, if you like this video, please consider If you like this video, please like and subscribe!